Sisters and brothers, this is the word of the Lord. You know, someone asked me last week, after I said that was the passage that I had preached on my very first sermon, almost 40 years ago. And they said, how's your preaching different now? And there are lots of answers about that. My journey has been an interesting one. I remember that when I went to seminary, I was the only student in my class that had already been preaching for 8 years by the time I got to seminary. And the preaching teacher said, I don't really want to have Bruce in the preaching class. And she said, he probably already has so many bad habits that I don't want it to rub off on the people that I'm trying to teach. So worse than that, I was already preaching every Sunday. She drove down to Peatone and didn't tell me which Sundays she was coming. And there was my preaching teacher certain Sundays. I would say, though, that the way that my preaching has changed the most is when I began, I wanted to pick topics that I carefully controlled and understood so I would never look bad or at a loss for words, or stumbling around in front of people who had come to worship. But I realized over time that it was a much richer, more thorough, satisfying adventure when I picked subjects that were questions for me and we looked at them together. That a lot of times I didn't have the right answers or that I had to work like crazy. That's what this week is about. I picked this passage because I had never thought of it before in terms that the message puts it. And I want to focus for right now on this verse. It's verse 9. He says, "It seems to me that God has put us who bear his message on stage in a theater in which no one wants to buy a ticket." Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like you have this whole idea, this whole enthusiasm, this whole generosity, and you want to bring it, and no one wants to hear it? That you have a great idea and no one wants your opinion? That you have some energy in life to give something and no one thinks you're of any value? It's like a little sneak peek into Paul. He spent the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians basically trying to get them to get in line. And he's going to spend the next 4 chapters explaining some of the things that give you a look into the church he's trying to deal with. He goes right from this into how Christians should avoid suing each other, sexual immorality, what kinds of things we need to do to not be falling into idols of the Gentiles. This is a real church with real people. And he spends some time trying to get them to know that. But right here is this little opening when he says, have you ever felt like you're on stage in a theater, ready to bring what you have to bring, and nobody wants to buy a ticket? Have you ever felt that lost? And in that one verse, he gives them a look. Now, in the other passages, the image he uses is one that Eugene Peterson in the Message has changed to a theater in an empty house. It talks about a procession into Rome and being at the rear, is what he says. And what that means is the generals came in first, and then the regular army, conquering army, came in second. And then the army members that they had paid that had worked for the Roman Empire came next. And then the soldiers that they had captured came after that. And then right at the end were the ne'er-do-wells that they had grabbed and were saving to take on the lions in the Colosseum. They were at the end of the parade. And that's where Paul says Christians, the apostles, the ones really trying to do it. You know it's going to be a bad day, they say, if your twin sister forgets your birthday. If you show up for a blind date and it's your ex, you know it's going to be a bad day. If you're driving around the expressway and your horn gets stuck and you're behind a group of Hell's Angels, it's probably going to be a bad day. He feels like it's a bad day because Paul's putting his face and his hope and his health and his life in line with this church and all the other churches. The message in here is to the Corinthian church, basically, you're just too big for your britches. You think you've already made it, and you haven't. You think you've achieved perfection, and all it's doing is getting in the way of your authenticity. But I would like to say a good word for the Corinthian church. They're his problem child. There's no doubt about it. And he writes 2 specific letters that we have, and he alludes to other letters. It's almost like he writes to the Ephesians and gives them some kind of information. He writes to the Galatians, and they says, I got to write the Corinthians again. They're the group that he spends time with the most because they're the squeaky wheel of the New Testament. But there's hope in that. I just made some notes of the reasons that I like them. First of all, they're brand new Christians. And they're working a program even if they don't completely understand the program. And you got to love them for that. If the church in Corinth was a disciple, they'd be Peter. Because they're always trying to work something and they never get it exactly right. They make mistakes, but they do it enthusiastically. And here's basically, when you listen to the problems that Paul talks about to the church in Corinth, this is a collection of pagan, alcoholic, sexually immoral, legalistically suing, pagan meat-eating people. Oh, and then a few different versions of sexual immorality. You got to love this church because it's just like every church in 21st century America. It's just like us. They have egos and they don't know how to deal with them. They're trying to con someone. They look at themselves and say, I'm based on this because of who I know or where I've been, who baptized me, who I studied with. And Paul looks at him and says, have you ever felt like you're on a stage in a theater where nobody wants to buy a ticket? Have you ever felt like you're on the mound throwing fastballs and there's nobody behind the plate catching? Have you ever felt like you have a great idea and everybody's got earplugs in? That's what it means, he tries to say. That's what it means to be a follower. That's what it means to be a believer. Now, he gets more graphic with them later on. What Paul's trying to say is, you think you're all that and you're not. You think you have all that strength and you don't. And Paul gives them his pedigree in the next letter to the church in Corinth. Because he's drawing a line. The Corinthians have basically said, here's what we're going to do. We know how we want to behave. We know what we want to look like. We know the way that we want to act. So we're going to find someone who teaches that way. And that'll be our apostle. That'll be our new person that we follow. And so they get way off the track on all these false teachings, and Paul spends a whole chapter on talking about the false apostles and Paul. And in chapter 11, he gives them his pedigree. He tells them why he's being used by God. He tells them what his work ethic has been that they should listen to him. And here's what he says, comparing himself. Now think about what you would say to try to convince someone you're legit. Here's how Paul does it. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I may sound like a madman, but I've served him far more. I have worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped more times without number, faced death and again. 5 different times Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a night and day adrift at sea. I've traveled on many long journeys. I've faced danger from rivers and from robbers. I've faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I've faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. And I've faced danger from men who claim to be believers, but are not. I've worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty, and have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. Then besides all this, I have the daily burden of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my feeling that weakness? Makes you want to just join in and follow him, doesn't it? What he's trying to tell them is about what real ministry means and what real commitment is and what real devotion is. And he develops for the church in Corinth and for the early church and for you and for me this idea of what it is. It's not who you know. It's not how rich you are. It's not how far or high you have climbed. He uses two words to tell them what it means to be at the center of being a follower. The first word he uses can either be translated servant or minister. We talk about that in spiritual gifts. A part of the whole beginning of the spiritual gifts class is to get people who have taken it over the idea of being perfectly frightened by the fact that they will have a ministry. In spiritual gifts, we just call it the M word. You have one. But all ministry means is how you're going to give back, how you're going to serve. And the Greek word for servant, have you ever seen those big Roman ships, and down in the bottom they have those long oars that come out on both sides? And so they're kind of like down in the complete bottom of the ship. And then there's a whole deck where life goes on up there. The soldiers are, and the people who are plotting the course, and the one who's steering the ship. But down in the bottom is that without windows, there's just an opening enough for the oars, the long oars on both sides, and there's someone down there telling them, keep rowing, keep rowing, keep rowing, keep pulling, keep pulling, keep pulling. And they can't always even see where they're going. Someone just tells them, keep pulling the oars, keep pulling the oars. And you know that word? Servant, minister. It's the same one Paul uses in the New Testament. Sometimes, do you ever feel like you're pulling the oar and you're feeling the water and someone's yelling, you're pulling, you don't even know if you're getting anywhere. You have to trust God. And the other image he uses, the other word, is the one who's the boss of a rich person's household, the one who's the steward of the master. And the steward has this really weird position because the steward has to recognize that the steward is a slave, but the slave with a big responsibility. The slave who keeps all the other slaves serving the master's household. The one who's answerable to the master. The one who's supposed to encourage and motivate the slave. But the one who's supposed to recognize that no matter how hard he works, no matter how good his work ethic is, no matter how much he comes in line, no matter how much money he saves the master, how well the food is prepared, how efficiently the household is run, guess what? He's still always a slave. He's never the master. And the Corinthians are saying, well, we pretty much have this Christian thing down. It's working for us. We know who's who, we know who's on top, and that defines who's on the bottom, and this is how we're going to do it. And Paul says, no, you're not. What you're going to do is be a servant. And while the boat is going through the water, you're going to be the one pulling the oars down on the lower deck. And in the household of God, you're going to be the one who turns to encourage the other slaves, who reports to the master, and who keeps the household going and growing. That's who you are. It's not who you know. Or maybe it is. It's that if you really, truly know Jesus, you will serve as he served. You'll minister like he ministered. You'll look like him. I was looking on a website, and I can't even remember how I got there now. It was a church management. It wasn't a church website. It was a secular one on unemployment. And they had this list on there. I think it was tongue-in-cheek, but I don't know the business world, so it may not be. They said that what you do to determine someone's gifts in business, this is what you do. They said you bring the person in and you shut them in a room and lock them in there with 400 bricks. And you leave them there for 6 hours. When you come back, you'll know where that person belongs in your corporation. If they're counting the bricks, they go to accounting. If they're recounting, they go to auditing. If they've messed up the whole place and there are bricks everywhere, engineering. If they're laying on the bricks sound asleep, security. If they break the bricks up into little tiny pieces, those are the IT guys. If they're throwing the bricks at each other, operations. If they've already left for the day, marketing. If they're staring out the window, strategic planning. And if they're completely ignoring the bricks and doing this, you congratulate them that they've been promoted to top management. If you find that there are people with the 400 bricks who have made a wall that they are hiding behind where no one can see them or hear them, you suggest they're not fit for your company and see if you can get them to run for Congress. I just looked at the website. I have a sense that if somehow you find them examining the bricks, seeing where the bricks will fit best, having a heart for the bricks, knowing that each brick is different, you might be in personnel. God is in the personnel business. Paul is saying, each of you will have a chance to serve. Each of you will be a steward in the kingdom. Each of you will know this feeling. If you haven't already, it's coming, he says. Have you ever been on stage in a theater where no one wants to buy a ticket? Don't let other people's judgments get you, he says. Don't let your judgments get you. That's how he begins this chapter. We didn't read it, but if you get a chance this afternoon, read all of 4, because at the beginning, he talks about those judgments, and he says, don't be swayed by other people's judgments. You're going to end up in a wrong place. Because they'll always be wrong. They'll either think too highly of you or too little of you. And Paul says, I don't look at my own judgments either, because I tend to either think too highly of myself or too little. God, on the other hand, thinks just right, he says. Just right. God's in the personnel business. And God is not so interested in our success and our ability. God is interested in our faithfulness. I have known pastors who have served in churches for 40 years, for 50 years, and have never preached to more than 60 people. Because that's where God put them. And the measure for them at the end of their ministry was one thing: faithfulness. Remember at the beginning I said to you what I used to try to do was control my sermon situations? It's because I was trying to present an air of perfection. I don't know why, nobody buys it. But what I've decided is perfection gets in the way of authenticity. Paul is saying to the people in Corinth, please do not be concerned or impressed with what other people think about you, or what you think about you, or who you know, or how much you have. It's about faithfulness. And I wanted to end with a literary story to send you out on, and I picked one. This is pretty high literature, so you may have to bear with me. It's from The Velveteen Rabbit. And I don't know if you haven't read it, you probably know about it. This was read to me as a child, and I never got it till I was about 15. And now I think I get it even more. This is in a nursery, and in this particular section, the skin horse, who's been there longer than anybody else, is trying to explain to the Velveteen Rabbit, who's made out of this cheap fabric that's not as nice and wonderful as the other toys. That's probably enough to get you started. The skin horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old, most of his hairs in his tail had been pulled out down to string bead necklaces. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced, like the skin horse, understand all about it. "What is real?" asked the Velveteen Rabbit one day when they were lying side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you're made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, who was always truthful. "But when you're real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" the rabbit asked, "or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the skin horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off." And all the bald guys are smiling right now. Let me get back. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off. And your eyes drop out, and you get loose in your joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all. Because once you are real, you can't be ugly. Except to people who don't understand. Have you ever felt like you're on a stage in a theater where no one wants to buy a ticket? God put you there to be faithful. Beyond any imaginings of who we know or where we think we belong or what we should do, God says, "I'm the personnel manager, and this is where you belong. So go and grow and bloom." It is God's way. It's a good way. Even though being real and authentic hurts sometimes, you don't mind if you're being faithful. Amen. Now may we give